Welcome to the Advancing Cyber Podcast Origin Series. Many of us began working in cybersecurity in the late 90s or early 2000s, maybe a little before that, before Homeland Security and much of what we know as cybersecurity today. I wanted to capture the origin stories from those who were there, living it and helping to build the technologies, laws, and policies that we all know today. So let's go back to the beginning, or at least close to it. We can't start this series without truly beginning at the beginning. And for me, cybersecurity policy begins in the 1990s, and it begins with our guest today, Richard A. Clarke. Dick is the founder and CEO of Good Harbor Security Risk Management and is an advisor to public and private sector leadership on all issues of cybersecurity and crisis management. Dick served in the White House for an unprecedented 10 years as special advisor to the president on cybersecurity, serving under President George H.W. Bush, President Bill Clinton, and President George W. Bush. Clarke advised on counterterrorism and served on the National Security Council for 10 years. In his role as the nation's cyber czar, Clarke developed the country's first national strategy to defend cyberspace. It wasn't listed on his bio, but he was also the head of the president's Critical Infrastructure Protection Board, which is where I got to know him and just harassed him endlessly about all things cyber. We're going to talk about a lot of that today. He is the author of the national #1 bestseller, Against All Enemies, as well as Cyber War, the Next Threat to National Security and What to Do About It. I'm the co-author of Fifth Domain, Defending Our Country, Our Companies, and Ourselves in the Age of Cyber Threats with Robert K. Kanaki. His most recent book, Artificial Intelligentsia, is also available for purchase now. Dick, when I think about government and cybersecurity policy, it starts with you. So much of what is in place today is early days, pre-9/11, you, or immediate post-9/11, also you. And so we're going to get into a lot of that. But as I was thinking about some of the origins of cyber and critical infrastructure, I realized I don't know how you actually first got into cyber.
Well, it's an odd angle. It's an odd vector for approaching it. I was doing a number of different things in the Clinton White House. One of them was counterterrorism. And we had the terrible Oklahoma City bombing in the mid-1990s, where in the heartland, not in New York or Washington, but in the heartland, almost in a random city, a whole block was taken out. An entire federal building was taken out. A daycare center taken out by American terrorists, people who just had a thing against the federal government. And they used readily available explosives, ammonium nitrate, and a whole trailer truck full of it. And after that, President Clinton was very shaken by that. We had been dealing with terrorism, some of it in the United States. We'd had an attack on the World Trade Center almost as soon as the president came into office. But we had nothing like this, no huge explosion killing many, many people. And around the same time, there was a weird Japanese terrorist group called the Aum Shinrikyo, which developed its own chemical weapons and its own biological weapons and attacked the Tokyo subway station. And I was talking with the president, and he kind of put these two attacks together and said, what if instead of a large trailer truck filled with ammonium perchloride blowing up a federal building, what if it had been a biological attack or a chemical attack? And what if instead of it being a random federal building, it went after an important node in our communications system or an important node in our transportation system, or worse yet, 5 or 6 nodes? Could a small group of people who understood our interconnectivity really take us down, really do damage to the nation? And we said, well, yeah, possibly. We've never looked at that. And he said, well, let's look at it. So we started a presidential commission. We got a very good group of people to put on it. Janet Reno, the attorney general at the time, was very much behind doing this. There's an Air Force general named Marsh, General Marsh, who was the chairman of the commission. And it was supposed to look at the vulnerability of what we came to call critical infrastructure. I still wish there were a better name because I can't say critical infrastructure without spitting. It's just a mouthful. We called it critical infrastructure, and we asked the commission to look at the new threats to it. And they came back about 18 months later after a huge amount of effort. They had a big staff. They spent a lot of time going around the country interviewing people. And they came back and they didn't talk at all about what we had asked them, what we thought we had asked them to do. Instead, they came back and said the critical infrastructure that you have to worry about is the fact that this new thing, the internet, is being connected to traditional infrastructure. It's being connected to the electric power grid, to the water and sewage systems, to the transportation systems from railroads to air traffic control. And from what we can tell, they said, it's pretty vulnerable. That the internet was never designed with security in mind, was never actually designed to do all the things that we're now making it do. And we need to get on top of this because it's getting out of control. Well, it was a wake-up call. We all knew the internet was exploding. It was something, it had been around technically for well over a decade, but there was an explosion of use of it in the around 90, 94, 95, 96. And we didn't understand everything that was happening. There was no government system that was looking at this new phenomenon. No one was in charge. Organizations in and out of government were just connecting things to the internet. And productivity was going through the roof. The economy took off like a rocket. And Al Gore and Bill Clinton were running around taking credit for it all, some of which was deserved, but not all of it. And people thought, well, the internet's a great thing. And to suddenly be told, well, wait a minute, it may not be. Well, we knew we had to have antivirus systems, and we knew that you had to have firewalls, but, that was about it. The malicious activity on the internet didn't seem to be a big deal. Certainly not a big enough deal that the White House should be worrying about it. The Marsh Commission convinced us otherwise. And so when the president read it and the staff read it, and we said, well, we got to set up some permanent mechanisms. And we sat around thinking, well, where are we going to do this? There's obviously going to be some White House role here to kick it off. Maybe we can spin it out to a department later, although we didn't know what department. But initially, there's so many different parts of the government involved. There's got to be a White House role. So we suggested a White House coordinator and the national security advisor. And the president came back and said, well, that's you. And I said, oh, no. I have a day job. And you've given me so many different portfolios to begin with. I can't possibly take on another one. Besides, I don't know anything about this stuff. To which they said, well, no one knows anything about this stuff. That's kind of the point. What you do know is how to make diverse parts of the government work together. And you do understand the threats, and you're sort of a little bit paranoid, like more than a little. So kicking and screaming, I got this extra portfolio. And around the same time, the Joint Chiefs of Staff came to me with their annual surprise exercise plan. They had a surprise exercise every year called Eligible Receiver. And it changed its focus every year. And they said, in light of all of this stuff that was going on, they said, this year we're going to make it a cyber attack on the Pentagon. We're going to have a small group of people, mainly from NSA, some from the military, and we're going to ask them to see, without any inside knowledge, without any wiring diagrams or organizational diagrams, or just what you can find out publicly through open sources. We're going to see what they can do over the course of a work week to get into sensitive networks in the Pentagon. And we'd like you to be part of the control group. I said, okay, who knows about this in the Pentagon? Well, the secretary, the deputy secretary, and the general counsel. And if that's it? Yeah, that was it. Obviously, the chairman of the joint staff and the planning group and the joint staff knew. And so they ran it. And we were supposed to get reports twice a day, Monday through Friday. And by the afternoon of Monday, when we had the report was they had gotten into the war room. They had gotten into the National Military Command Center, and they were in a position to issue orders to forces around the world. I stopped the exercise. I didn't see any point in going beyond that.
Red team won on that one.
Really quickly. And so we went to the Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time and gave him the results. And he was just absolutely flabbergasted and frightened and said, well, what do we do to stop this? And he said, well, we've got firewalls, don't we? Yes. And we have antivirus. Yes. Well, what else can we do? Well, that was about all you could buy in those days. But a company in Atlanta called ISS had invented the intrusion detection system, the IDS. And so I said, well, there's this new thing, the IDS. And he said, fine, let's put that on everything we can put it on. I'll waive all the procurement rules, just somebody go out and do it. And I remember I was sitting there thinking at the time, boy, I wish I had stock in IDS. So after a few months, it was all installed and we came back to the Deputy Secretary and we got reports from various people around the table of how it was going. And I remember this one Army general said, I want to disconnect this thing. It's a pain in the ass. Before you put this IDS on our network, nobody was attacking us. And now it's alarming all the time. And I thought, okay, we really do have a problem here. That's the level of understanding. So then the question was, how do we set up an interagency process? And we were beginning to get some interest from the Congress in sort of evolving threats, emerging threats, particularly terrorism, but other things as well, like biological terrorism and cyber. And they wanted to know who was in charge. Well, there really wasn't a person in charge, but I had set up a series of committees and I thought they were beginning to work well. I had a committee on terrorism. I had a committee on chemical, biological threats. I had a committee on cyber threats. And we were beginning to make some progress. But the political types in the White House decided we needed to have someone who was the face of all of this and who could go up and talk to the Congress and get them to calm down. And so they came up with the idea of creating a national coordinator for security, counterterrorism, and critical infrastructure. And the president announced it at a commencement at Annapolis. And it was me. and so then I had this title that was so long it couldn't fit on the business card. It didn't change a whole hell of a lot, but we codified what we were doing in a presidential decision document, PDD 62 and 63. And we tried with PDD 63 to write it in a way that most of it could be made public. And it laid out a work program. What those presidential documents are really good for is articulating the president's intent. You know, what's policy? What's he want? And then a work program to get there with saying specifically who's going to do what.
So PDD 63 turned 25 last May.
Yeah, I know.
Crazy. It's old enough to rent a car. How
At least I didn't have to pay to go to college. Right?
How hard was it to come to agreement on the language of that? Because for the most part, the concept of the critical infrastructure, the importance of which or the loss of which would have a serious and detrimental effect on the United States, like that endures. Right? That's powerful language. How did that come about?
Well, so there was a committee effort to write it, and it ended up looking like a committee effort. It was a real camel. And I took it away and sat down and wrote it myself, just through. And then, frankly, we used the sharp elbows in the fact that we were at the White House and other agencies weren't, and we just forced it through. The real problem, you say, what was the problem in getting it done? The real problem was no one believed that this threat was real. I won't say nobody, but, you know, there were beginning to be attacks, and it was beginning to be clear that the Marsh Commission was right. But there had never been a big, serious attack. And we hadn't been good at detecting some of the attacks that were going on. And so people weren't They didn't know anything about the nature of the technology. They didn't know anything about the nature of the threat. What actually helped were the initial attacks. And some of them were much less than they initially appeared. The FBI and the Defense Department gave them code names, and code name of one of them that I remember at the beginning was Solar Sunrise, where we were threatening to bomb Iraq, as we did periodically during that time, in some showdown with Saddam Hussein over nuclear weapons. And suddenly, several of the air bases that would have been involved in supporting that kind of operation detected that someone had hacked in and taken control of their internet connectivity. And so we thought, oh my God, the Iraqis or the Syrians or somebody, or maybe even the Russians, had done that. And we didn't really have a system in place to deal with a crisis like that. So we set up a system for crisis response for major hacks. We pulled together across government all the right people. It was a criminal investigation as well as an intelligence investigation. So we had to get around the Justice Department hang up. They couldn't tell anybody anything during a criminal investigation. But what we ultimately found out was there's a bunch of teenagers who had done it. One in Israel and a couple in the United States. So initially, that was a relief. It wasn't a nation-state threat. And then we thought, well, shit, if teenagers can do this, we really must have poor security. But that one in particular got a lot of high-level focus, in part because I kept reporting it up to the president and the cabinet members. There were a couple of others. There was Code Red, which was a worm that spread into.
So let's stay on Solar Sunrise for just a second, though. That's 98, and that's largely government. Then we hit Y2K, which is government and industry, right? Because I met you right around Y2K, and you're extremely busy with that transition and helping make sure that the world didn't melt at that point. Once we got through that, we came back into cyber. And it was my perception, and I'm curious if this was consistent with yours or not, but it was my perception that pre-Y2K, it was largely government-focused incidents. But once we started moving into the Code Red NIMDA era, that's when we started to see more government and industry collaboration, starting to think about, are we going to deal with this in a more blended way? Does that track with your experience?
Yeah, although I tried to get industry involved earlier. There was one, I forget precisely when this happened, 98, 99. There was one week where there was a widespread series of attacks on e-commerce sites. And I thought, this is a great opportunity. So I went to the president and said, why don't we have the heads of all of these e-commerce sites and the heads of all the internet-related companies, bring them in. Let's have a cyber summit where we sit around in the cabinet room with you and you tell all these guys they have to get more serious about security. So we did. And we brought in, I forget who it was from Microsoft, very senior person, may have been Bill Gates, and the head of AOL and the head of Yahoo and the head of Amazon. And it was a pretty stellar group of Silicon Valley type executives and companies involved in e-commerce. And we briefed them on our policies about cybersecurity and the threat and how we were going to do more in the government. They had to do more. And I don't know if much specifically came out of it, but the fact that the president was sitting around in the cabinet room with all of these private sector guys, and that was on national TV. And they all, walked out of the West Wing and stood in front of a bunch of reporters and had to talk about cybersecurity. That, I thought, sent a real message to the private sector that the government is on this. The government is expecting you to do better than this. And you got to step up your game with regard to cybersecurity. They didn't, for the most part. Some of them did, but for the most part, they didn't. But we did write something then called the National Strategy for Cybersecurity.
So before we jump into this, I want to point out to people, because I don't think you get enough credit for the fact that in this time period, you built an amazing team of people. And So the group that you had in the President's Critical Infrastructure Protection Board were just such a dedicated group and a real terrific assortment of skills that as you were preparing to build into this national strategy conversation, you just had such an amazing crew of folks who were either technical, great listeners, great writers, real policy minds, that it made this coming energy possible. And that can't have been an accident.
Well, when you're in the White House, and particularly when you have a new initiative, you can cherry pick people who are already in the government, of their departments and agencies. You can call up a cabinet member or secretary and say, I want that person by name. Or you can say, I don't know anybody. My favorite story was I was advised by someone in the Coast Guard that there was this crackerjack young woman, very junior, named Tiffany Olson, and I should really get her. So I knew the commandant of the Coast Guard pretty well. And I called up and said, we're creating this thing and the president's given me the right to cherry pick people. And he was expecting me to say an admiral or something. And I said, this lieutenant. And he said, oh, well, I don't know her. Of course not. She's a lieutenant. You're a 4-star admiral. But we got her and she was amazing. And to this day, she's amazing and doing great stuff for cybersecurity. She has been all along. So some of the people we got together didn't know any more than I did, or less. Some of them were expert. We got Howard Schmidt from Microsoft, which was a big signal, I think, to the private sector. My deputy for cyber was from industry. But when we wrote the first strategy in the Clinton administration, we did it all within the government. And it was a good strategy, but it got criticized mainly by Republicans because they hadn't done it. Clinton had done it, but also because it was entirely a government work product. So when Bush came into office and asked me to stay on, I said, well, let's do a Bush strategy for cyberspace. And let's not make it substantively different, because I think we were pretty close to the mark on the first one, but let's build it in a participatory way. Let's go around the country and have in every region of the country a White House town hall on cybersecurity, open to the public, and with a panel of experts from that region, and lay out the problem as a kind of an educational thing, lay out the problem, and then ask for the experts from that region, whether they were academic or in the private sector, to make suggestions. So we did that. We went around the
I
country.
remember my company sending me to multiple regions just to go hear what you guys were talking about. Like, I remember having to go to like 4 or 5 regions in addition to the DC event, even though I knew you all and had already had all these conversations. Like,
and
they was worried.
Yeah, the meetings were not terribly different one from the other. But
I know.
But they got people involved, and they told, we're on the local news in Denver, we're on the local news in LA. And then what we did simultaneously was we took what we called the critical infrastructure industry sectors: banking, transportation, technology. I think there were initially 7 sectors. And we said, you all need to get together without us. You all need to get together privately without the government at the table. We're not going to tell you how to secure your industry. You need to tell us how you're going to secure your industry. So you all need to get together and organize, and together write your section of the plan, your annex to the plan, the financial services and banking sector plan, the technology sector plan, the transportation sector plan. And they loved it. And they thought, well, not only was the government listening, the government was like admitting it didn't know how to do this, and that the expertise lay with the owners and operators. And it wasn't going to regulate, because we said up front, we're not going to regulate, which was the right thing to do then. I'm not sure it's the right thing to do now, but it was the right thing to do then. So we were giving all the right signals.
Mm-hmm.
And Cisco actually took the lead for the technology sector. Microsoft was active, but the Cisco took the lead along with Symantec and RSA. And the whole process of getting people to sit around the table together. And oh, by the way, we told them We gave them a letter saying there will be no antitrust problem if you collude on this. So we removed all the legal barriers that we could, because some people wanted to throw up antitrust and say, oh, we can't do it. So we removed all of that, and we made them talk to each other. And we made CEOs sign off on it. So sector by sector, CEOs were being told, this is the person in your company who's in charge of this. I remember going to Oracle and meeting with Larry Ellison, and the person in charge of cybersecurity at Oracle had never met him. And so came up to me after the meeting and said, thank you so much for coming all the way out here from the White House to talk to Larry about this. Now he knows I exist. And that kind of thing was going on throughout the country. Meanwhile, the reason I went to Oracle, same reason I went to Microsoft and Cisco and elsewhere, was I didn't know enough about the technology. And it was not a good book. There was not a good college course. And I wanted to learn more. I wanted to have some technical chops. And so, when you're in the White House, you can call up and say, the White House calling. And you can call Bill Gates' office, which is what we did. And said, the president's appointed this guy. He'd like to come out and talk to you. And then after he talks to you, he'd like to talk to your experts. And we did this company after company after company after company. And what I found was the software people only knew the software. So Microsoft really didn't know much about how routers worked. And you go to Cisco to learn about routers. They didn't know much about the software. And you go to Verizon or AT&T, the backbone carriers. They didn't know much about anything but backbone carriers. And there really wasn't anywhere that had kind of a holistic understanding of the technology, but mainly of the security risks involved in the technology and how they all come together. Because, as you know, a lot of the risks are at the seams where the technologies come together.
And ironically enough, that's still an issue and a risk today. Yeah. I guess as you think about where we were then, I'm reflecting on the fact that the very questions and themes you were wrestling with when you were creating PDD 63 are still unresolved today. Like, we still don't have good answers to the questions about, the internet being connected to everything. Now, OT is being connected to everything, and eventually AI is going to be connected to everything. We still don't live in a security first world. So as you think about the authorities that you didn't have when you were in the White House, and the way that your hands may have been tied just because of the way government was structured, what authorities do you think government needs to be more effective in leading us towards where we have to go? Because we know these problems, they're gigantic.
Well, we tried initially to do it all without regulation. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's right. You want to see if that's possible. I kind of knew it wouldn't be. But first in the Clinton administration, then in the Bush administration, two administrations that really tried to be industry friendly, and particularly in the early days of the technology, didn't want to bury it in regulation. Eventually, however, the individual agencies started regulating. And so the banking regulators, the FDIC, the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve Board, started coming up with very specific regulations for the banking industry. And one by one, other regulatory agencies at the state level and at the federal level came up with regulations for their sector. It's a hodgepodge. It's not systematic. And if I had to do it all over again, I think what I'd like to do, and we probably could still do this, is get all the regulators together and see what common elements there are. When I say all the regulators, I mean the state ones too, because California, New York, and others are taking the lead in some of this stuff. And have in mind the EU regulations, because that's the other big regulatory authority in the world. And see if you can't conform a set of regulations that are clear, understandable, and universal, at least in the United States. And yeah, if you have to tailor some of them for the industry, obviously some things that you need for banking, you don't need for airlines, and vice versa. But I think it would be nice to have an even playing field, have it be federal, not state, and Part of it has to address privacy, which is a related parallel issue. And now, as you point out, part of it is AI, because it's still early enough in the evolution of AI that we could reduce some of the security risk through appropriate regulation.
Do you think that AI is the most important challenge that we have facing us in cybersecurity, or is there something before that on your list?
I think AI is potentially the most important solution if we do it properly. If you look at the average security operations center in a major enterprise, that major enterprise is running somewhere between 50 and 70 different specific cybersecurity apps from 20 or 30 different providers. And the people in the SOC are looking at alarms going off. They've got a SIM, they've got a SOAR, helping them prioritize. They've got intelligence feeds coming in. They've got patch cadence to worry about. It's a lot. And they should also be doing threat hunting and anomaly detection. And no one does that particularly well. I think there is the potential for AI doing a lot of that. If you can train it on the right training data and giving it live feeds of the new CVEs, the new patch requirements, the new cyber intelligence reports, I would love to see the day when AI is doing the first cut of running the SOC. Sure, there has to be a human in the loop, but it's getting to the point where the attackers are using AI, adversarial AI, in a variety of ways to make old-fashioned attacks better. Phishing is better, much better, now that AI is doing the phishing. They're using it for password spraying, and they're using it for credential stuffing. They're using it for anomaly detection, vulnerability detection, and probably for zero-day exploit writing. It's a lot to respond to without having an AI on the defense. I don't know if this will work. No one's ever tried it. As far as I know, no one is even planning it. But it would be fun to get an enterprise to experiment with a whole of enterprise AI system, not AI embedded in the applications, but AI sitting above them all too.
I can't imagine a scenario where, let's just pick on Mandiant for a moment, where their hunters writing detections when they find something new wouldn't get coupled with their AI just to even be testing out, are they enhancing and finding new things? Like, that's got to happen. I completely agree with you.
I think it is, but I think it's happening in stovepipes.
Yes. Yeah. Is the proof of concept starts, I think, early days. But it's an exciting concept.
Yeah, and it is fusion. It's AI-empowered SOAR and SIM, to simplify it. But I think if I have hope of solving this problem, that's where it lies. The other thing that, when I tried to learn about this, there was no book. There was no course. So Rob Kanaki and I wrote a book, Cyber War, and then we wrote the sequel, The Fifth Domain. And we didn't think they'd sell very well because it's kind of a narrow issue. They did sell very well, particularly Cyber War became the thing that people were handed. I remember a senior officer at Cyber Command general told me, "Hey, I'm just a fighter pilot. I didn't know anything about this stuff, and I became the deputy commander of Cyber Command. And the first thing they did was hand me your book as a way of telling me what this is all about."
A good place to start.
And then the other thing that happened, and I give Janet Reno credit for this in part. Janet said we need a ROTC, an ROTC program. And I said, "Madam Attorney General, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, we need colleges to teach this stuff, and we need people to go into it. And ROTC pays scholarships. And that's why students join the Army and the Navy, because they got a scholarship for a free ride for 4 years at a private college." I said, "Oh, wow, yeah. Let me think about that." So I went off, I talked to NSA, I talked to the Commerce Department at that point, and the Office of Personnel Management. And we created something called CyberCore, the scholarship for STEM. Yeah, the scholarship.
That's how that started? That's so cool.
NSA had been working with a handful of universities to develop curriculum. And I said, well, okay, I don't want NSA developing the curriculum. Let's have the faculty people do it. And but let's create a sort of standard curriculum and a way of certifying a university. And again, I don't want the government certifying the university. I want professors getting together and certifying the university. So we blew out the program to a number of schools. I think we went from like 4 or 5 to like 40. Now it's over 100. And the deal, it's still not widely known, but the deal is if you go to one of these universities, you can get 2 years paid for, either at the undergraduate level or the master's level, full boat, room, board, tuition, and spending money if you're majoring in cybersecurity. And you promise, and it's a really small promise, for every year that we pay for, the government pays for, you will work for the federal government. So if you get the 2-year boat, you'll come when you graduate, you'll come and work for a federal agency somewhere on cybersecurity for 2 years. And we thought they'll do it for 2 years and then they'll leave the federal government. Well, they didn't, a lot of them. There are CISOs at federal agencies and departments all across the government who are alumni of this program. And we were later able to expand it to the community colleges. There aren't very many, but there are some. Northern Virginia Community College was the first. And so we are turning out. I know we need more trained professionals, but we are turning out a fair number through the Cyber Corps program and paying for it. And Admiral Mark Montgomery, who was, I think, a lieutenant commander at the time we created this, and he was part of the group that created it with me. He later became a 2-star admiral and then started working with the Congress, worked with John McCain and the Armed Services Committee and whatnot. Mark has every year been able to influence the Congress to increase the amount of money for Cyber Corps. So I think every time you talk about Cyber Corps, you need to give a shout out to Mark.
That's a wonderful legacy. I never knew how that started. That's a really cool story. Let's talk about the young folks that are coming into cybersecurity. What are the things you would encourage them to go learn about? What do you think are the skills or the areas that, obviously you can't see that far into the future. When you or I were going to school, none of this even existed, right? So the things that they go do may not exist today, but what are the skills that you think students or younger people should be going to learn about now that set them up to get started in cyber?
Well, it's now a very diverse subject, cybersecurity. As you know, and you're an expert on, there's cybersecurity law, right? You can be a lawyer and specialize in cybersecurity. So there's cybersecurity software writing and secure DevOps, which didn't exist. There's the role, if you want to be a chief information security officer someday in a major corporation. By the way, they get really well paid. Really well paid. Astonishing salaries for those people because it's a tough job. But to be a CISO at a major corporation, you not only need to understand IT, you also need to understand business. I would almost argue that an MBA is as helpful. An MBA plus a cyber degree is the best way to do that track if you want to be a leader in a company, if you want to be the CISO of a company. One of the first schools we had in the Cyber Corps program did that from the beginning, Idaho State. And Idaho State ran this wonderful, probably one of the top 5 cyber programs in universities across the country, but they ran it out of their business school, out of their MBA program.
Wow.
So everyone who graduated had a cyber concentration MBA. And that alumni group has been very successful.
That's wonderful. All right, last question. It is January 21st, 2025. You've been asked to come back into the White House as our next cyber czar. What is the first thing you do?
Say no.
I heard it's very hard to say no to the president.
I've had it.
You're one of the few who have.
I've said no to a lot of presidents. You have to. And they respect you, I think, if you do. I think the federal government has to be a model to the private sector. Regulation is a hard instrument to use to get people to do the right thing. But when you're the president, you can order the federal government to do things. You don't need regulation. And while there are some agencies in the government that are doing a good job, and most of them are not with regard to cyber, I would take the National Cyber Director and empower her to be able to run all the cybersecurity in the government. Maybe outside of the Defense Department, the intelligence community, because they'll never let you. But make that person the CISO, or have that person's deputy be a federal CISO, but not in the way that we've had a federal CISO in the past. They didn't really have power. I would take away from the civilian agencies in the government, I would take away the authority to run cybersecurity on their networks and give it to one federal office, whether that's CISA in Homeland or whether that's in the National Cyber Director's office. Create the core of federal cyber experts and have them run cybersecurity for all the agencies and departments. The Office of Personnel Management story tells the story. OPM was this tiny little organization, independent organization, the HR office for the federal government. And of course, they didn't know how to do cybersecurity, but they had this crown jewel on their network. They had everybody's security clearance, background information, all the details that the government has to learn about you in order to give you a top secret security clearance was sitting on the network of this little organization, OPM. Well, of course it got hacked by the Chinese. Well, that's in microcosm what's going on throughout the federal government. You cannot expect all these departments and agencies who have expertise in agriculture or forestry or whatever it is to be able to handle their own cybersecurity. We can create a model for the private sector by doing it right in the federal government. And I said that 25 years ago. I've never accomplished it. But I do believe it's possible to secure networks. You know, the old saw that there are two kinds of companies, those that have been hacked and know it, and those that have been hacked and don't know it. Well, you know, Rob Kiyosaki said, and I said in The Fifth Domain, there's a third kind. And that's the kind that really doesn't get hacked. Or if they get hacked, they contain it quickly and they're resilient. We need to create that model, the third kind, in the federal government and show how it can be done and show that it can be done.
Oh, I love that. Having a federated enterprise across the U.S. federal government would be game-changing, absolutely game-changing. And frankly, whoever is that federal CISO, be it CISA, be it ONCD, would have the authority to then actually hunt for threats across the federal estate. And what that would do, beyond actually finding bad guys, is that it would give them data about what's actually happening in the federal government. And that would put them on par, frankly, with the others in the intelligence community, because in the threat intelligence world, knowledge is power. And right now, they have none.
I think you do a great job at it. I think you're perfect for it.
And on that note, I'd like to thank Dick for being our inaugural guest on our Advancing Cyber Podcast Origin Stories. It was a phenomenal conversation. I really enjoyed this. Dick, thank you. That was a lot of fun. And I look forward to having you back because I know this is the beginning. You've done so much in your career that I look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Kristen. I enjoyed it very much.
Take care.